Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, our 700th to be exact. Today, our guest is Christina Baker Kline, the author of The Exiles, which I believe is her 8th novel. It's going to be released on the 25th by Custom House, an imprint of HarperCollins that has some excellent titles out and to be released. We last spoke together on the Orphan Train's release, and she did an author event at the shop, and then we spent a lovely weekend together in the Hamptons at its annual Authors Night. I don't know how I missed her for a piece of the world, especially since it was about a place and persons near and dear to all of us. Chad Ford, Andrew Wyeth, Christina, different Christina. Christina's books have received numerous prizes, too numerous to mention in this short introduction. And Orphan Train was one of the one book, one read selections in hundreds of cities, including ours, and in colleges, schools all over the country. Her work appears in the New York Times, the Globe, the Chronicle, Psychology Today, Salon, many other periodicals. So, The Exiles. From the epigraph on, we glean that the book will be about us as well as the characters, much like the rings of a tree or the shells on a necklace. We identify with everyone, for good or for bad, and there are plenty of characters into which vessel we may fit, from our 3, 4 protagonists to the well-drawn peripheral characters, who really aren't that peripheral since they are so well-drawn. When you read the table of contents, you can learn a lot. And since I promised Christina, as usual, that I will stay away from spoilers unless I can get her to do them herself, I won't go any further. I will say that sometimes when you see a chapter listing going from character to character, you sometimes go, oh, I know I'm going to like one more than the other, and I'll be pissed off when I have to leave her for a while. But trust me, that won't happen here. The book is historical fiction in a lot of ways, but not quite. And if you look at the basis for the book on her excellent website, you can get a pretty good idea of the seed that brought forth this tree. But honestly, I would just wait until after you read the book, but that's just my opinion. So Evangeline, Mathena, and Hazel, and Ruby, for the most part, 3 very different women. But what they share is strength, struggle, emancipation, and triumph, which may seem a little off for those of you who have read it and will read it. But as a reader, I get to pick those characteristics, and you can't do anything about it. So let's see what Christina thinks about all that. Welcome, Christina, and thanks for joining us some 7 years, if you can believe it, since Orphan Train.
I'm so happy to be here, Sam, and I'll forgive you for ignoring my Wyeth book, and maybe when I come in virtually to chat with you at the bookstore, we can talk about that too.
But remember, I didn't ignore it in the introduction anyway, so.
I like that, and that was a beautiful introduction. Thank you.
Well, thanks. So I don't know, I do this. Let's start, I mean, a lot of people don't do this, but let's start from the epigraph, because I know you spent a lot of time on it, especially since its origin touches the book. And it's something that, like I said, you know, we should think about all the time, but we don't. It's like living in the moment. You forget to live in the moment. And at the same time, the past, it's with us, but we forget that it's with us. So talk about the epigraph and how you came up with it.
Okay. So I've always loved the Faulkner quote, which has become a bit of a cliche. The past is not, now I'm going to botch it, but something about the past is never dead. It's not even past. And I was reading a lot of Aboriginal literature and history as I was working on this book, and I came across this poet named Oodgeroo Noonuccal. She was the first Aboriginal poet to publish a book of poetry in the 60s. And one of her poems begins, "Let no one say the past is dead. The past is all about us and within." And that idea of carrying the past in our bones is something I've written about a lot and thought about a lot. And in this book, it particularly resonated because it takes place so long ago. It's in the 1840s. it takes place over about 4 years, and then we jump forward at the end 20-something years for the last section to sort of find out what happened to everyone. But as I was communicating with the estate of this poet, I got into a conversation about exactly how resonant it is and how she was able to articulate the desires and the longings and the sort of bittersweet sensations that a lot of Aboriginal people hadn't had articulated before or had not themselves articulated. And she spent her life as a social activist doing that. So it felt really important to include that epigraph.
Yeah, it's kind of like, but not exactly like the last lines of Gatsby, you know.
This beating back against the past. Current, yeah.
Numbers in his last lines, isn't it?
Yeah, the best.
Yeah,
and just so people know, I don't know if I've even said this yet, but it's this novel, the sort of big picture of the novel is it's the story of the convict women who transformed Australia and the Aboriginal people whose lives were destroyed when colonists landed on their shores. That was where I began with the book.
Yeah, and let's talk about the cover now, and then we'll get that out of the way. I just do it because it's my formula. And actually, your painting there has that same look.
I know, it's true. There's the cover.
That really does. So yeah, the cover, and I don't know, as usual, whether you vetted it, whether you came up with it, but there's a yellow sky that all of us may be familiar with, but it kind of is a gnomon for the entire story. And I wondered whether you picked that out.
Oh, for sure. We had, I'm always really involved in the covers, and some are successful and some are less successful, and we can't quite get it right. I feel like we got this cover exactly right. And the cover designer is just incredible. It's Mumtaz Mustafa, who works at HarperCollins. And we went through many iterations. I knew a ship on the ocean was, it felt like an epic kind of story. And the idea of having this is actually what those repurposed slaving ships, convict ships, look like. And there were many different color combinations, but I wanted the yellow and blue. I loved that. And then my name is in a kind of rose gold, and the way it jumps off the page with this battered, Mumtaz did this effect where she kind of beats up the image so that it looks like it's old and scratched. And I really wanted that. I love that.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and it does. It's like, you know, there's a number of kind of symbolic aspects of it because it's right in the middle of things. It's between the two places you're talking about. And I always like being in transit. This, of course, is not a transit that you want to be in, but there is something about being in transit because you're not in any particular place. You're not in the place where you came from or the place where you're going.
Right. When we came up with the Exiles as a title, it also felt really right because every character in the novel is in exile. And no matter what their circumstances or how they got there, they've been banished from their homes, and they're wandering, and they don't have an easy path or a clear direction. So that title felt right for this book in a way that you don't always get right either. I never loved the title A Piece of the World. I wanted to call that novel Christina's World, but my publisher wouldn't because of my own name. They said it would look like a memoir. I'm like, really?
Well, you actually talked, you know, even though you had a piece of the world in your mind or writing when we last met, you talked about Australia. And you even talked about the germ of the idea that this became. And that's 7 years ago.
I know. I often have ideas percolating for a long time. A lot of things led me to this topic. I had been a fellow, a Rotary fellow to Australia in my 20s. I was obsessed with The Fatal Shore, the book by Robert Hughes, this incredible epic story of what he called the founding of Australia. It's not called that anymore because the colonists coming in and taking over is no longer considered a founding in the same way. There are more disparaging ways to say that, I guess. But what I was struck by reading Robert Hughes's masterful book is that he only devoted one chapter to the story of the Aboriginal people and the convict women. It was one chapter together, not two separate chapters, out of this 688-page book. So that was what interested me the most, and I'd had that in the back of my mind for a long time. And then I went on to teach in two women's prisons, and was struck by the concept of incarceration as a topic. I wrote a book on feminism, and this book feels sort of feminist in some ways, even though it's not polemic in any way of speaking, but it is about women coming into a kind of recognition of power, and furthermore, women coming from this very stratified society in Britain, where they had no social mobility, to a kind of Wild West in unpopulated, lightly populated, certainly in their strata of white people society. They had a lot more movement when they came to Australia if they could live through those convict years.
Yeah, lots of chamber pots.
That is true.
That got to me after a while. Because Newgate and in the prison there, it's like, what a mess. How could you? And, well, I was going to start talking about Evangeline, but it's not my job to do that. Why don't you, because this will get us into the guts, so to speak, of the books, of the book. Let's talk a little bit about Evangeline and the other two protagonists, and maybe, we'll leave Ruby for later. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the theme.
Sure. My way into the story as I was writing it for myself was to have an educated character who in some ways was a stand-in for the reader. She reads, she lives a life of the mind. She's a governess, but she didn't have much practical experience. She was raised by a vicar, her father, and then when he died, he hadn't really made provisions for her, and she was thrown on the mercy of the sort of church, and they got her a job as a governess. And so she's thrown into this situation in London, the sophisticated world, with this man who sort of takes advantage of the fact that she doesn't know anything about the world. She gets accused of stealing a ring, and drama ensues, and she ends up in Newgate Prison, destined for the convict life in Australia. They called it the Land Beyond the Seas, and Britain discovered that they had a problem. So just to step back, America won the war in 1776, and they had been in the habit, Britain had been in the habit of dumping prisoners here. They dumped 50,000 prisoners on the shores of America. And when America won and said no more convicts, in fact, Benjamin Franklin said, why don't we just send them some rattlesnakes in response for these convicts that they're sending over here? They had to come up with a new place to send them. And so they eventually settled on Australia after looking at Africa and some other places. But they miscalculated, and they just sent mostly men. So by 1803, Australia was 9-to-1 men to women. And the Brits came up with this scheme to send women essentially as breeders to Australia under the flimsiest of circumstances. They plucked them off the streets, and that's how women started going over there. And so this governess is accused of stealing a ring, and then she pushes someone, and and it's called attempted murder, and she ends up on a convict ship. And so that's your entree into the story of the convict women.
Yeah, like the other woman who's basically stole a silver spoon, and that's it. And then you get 7 or 14 years. It's just amazing to think of. But then if you think of what we've done, say, for example, in internment camps for the Japanese during World War II, or the times we're in now, which are really scary.
People are terrible to each other And when you read all the accounts, when I went to this women's prison that I write about, the Cascades, a number of times, and you can see the ledgers and what people's crimes are and how many years they got, and you just can't believe how flimsy they were.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about what really started you on this book. And again, like I said, I wasn't kidding. Your website is excellent. The Q&A is excellent. The book clubs is excellent. And then, you put the ballets in about Christina, and there's lots of backstory about her. But what do you think? You think you should read that first? Do you think you should read the book first?
I think that people will probably be interested in that material more after they finish the book. That's the way I operate, at least. I read something, often fiction, and then it will send me down a rabbit hole of research about it. If you go to Wikipedia, for example, you can find lots about what I write about. There's a whole Mathina section. There's a section on these convict women. There's a lot about the history of Tasmania. And so that, for me, Wikipedia was both a starting point in some ways and a touchstone, in that it wasn't my primary research by any means, but when you go to the end of those entries, you get lots of links and you can find books and materials, and one thing leads to the next.
And that's why
sorry, go ahead.
Fiction at the beginning, because your acknowledgments are almost like an Eric Larson book at the end.
I know. I actually have talked to Eric Larson about that we've talked a lot about that, actually, about what he does in his fiction, in his nonfiction, I'm sorry. The tools of fiction.
I never tell him it's fiction. I made the mistake of doing that in the interview. He goes, no, if there's a quote in there, somebody said it.
He's very adamant about that. And because his work reads like fiction, that's why it's so popular. I mean, I think his Churchill book is a tour de force.
Everybody buys that in the bookstore.
Everybody buys that book. And it's the perfect time for it. I think we all crave a leader like Churchill. The amount of research he does and the way he keeps track of it. He actually, because we became friends when I was on tour. Oh, I did the Philadelphia Library with A Piece of the World, and he was coming. No, it was long ago. It was Orphan Train when I met you, actually, Sam. And I had a whole week of activities because it was the Philadelphia book, big community read. And he came in to do an event for his new book. And we ended up, I got a call at midnight. I was in my pajamas in bed at the Ritz. He was staying there too. And I got a call from our media handler woman. And she's like, Eric and I are down at the bar. Come down. And I was like, really? So I threw something over my pajamas and I ran downstairs and we just drank till the wee hours, and we became friends that way. And then he really actually influenced me as I have been writing books that involve a lot of research, because he has a technique that is super useful, which is that when he's writing, to your point about every quote being a real thing, everything he has, he can back up. He backs up with research, like every line practically. So as he's writing, he writes in parenthesis, the attribution, and he has all these short ways of saying it. And then I think his assistant goes in and pulls them out, but so that he always has a draft that has everything in it, all those attributions. And I do that because even though it's fiction, like the story of Mathina, my Aboriginal character, for example, is a true story, and I wanted to make sure I had the facts right.
And it's funny, when I read his books, all of a sudden I'm done, but I realized there's a whole bunch of pages afterwards, and I thought the book was done, and then I realized...
They're much shorter than you think.
1/4 of the book is notes.
I know.
Okay.
I love the notes.
Yeah, so here's the thing about Hazel. When I first saw her, she was so weak and so quiet and so not into being with anybody. I thought she wouldn't last too long. But I'm not giving anything away because you have the chapters. But I really didn't think she was going to be there that long, you know?
Yeah, she was such a joy to write, because Hazel is a scrappy, self-made little sprite. She comes into the story. She's 15 years old. She weighs about 80 pounds. She's Scottish. She's a Spitfire. She's from Glasgow. Her mother was terrible and basically turned her over to she was sent her out stealing and from a young age, and she got caught. So she's filled with anger, and She's she's resentful and she's quiet, but what I love about her is that she has real skills that are usable. And so she becomes an almost magic figure in that she's a midwife, and she grew up with her mother doing all these witchy potions, and she learned how to take care of people. So then she uses it to barter for things and to make her own way. And she's really a survivor. In a way, she was more fun to write than Evangeline, because Evangeline is sort of clueless and she's thrown into this situation that she doesn't understand, whereas Hazel's lived in it her whole life and she's like, okay, how do I survive this? I am going to get through this.
Right. It's like when Olive keeps making fun of her, calling her, Leanie, and saying, oh, I can't believe that you don't know this. Oh, and that leads me into the idea, and I really don't have to write them down because I remember them all, which is how I tell the book is good. But there's people that are really good. Actually, all of our protagonists are good, solid people. But then there's Olive, who, is iffy a little bit, but not that iffy. But then there's like Agnes, and she's there till whenever. And Cecil.
Not so good.
No, and Miss Grimsby, and then Dr. Dunn, who's a wonderful person that gradually becomes a wonderful person. And then there's Buck, and Eleanor, and the Franklins even. Although Mr. Franklin, I liked him a lot. He was like one of those Englishmen you read about who's going to be in the House of Lords and just kind of, out of Monty Python.
Totally.
And, but so look what I'm saying. I mean, Mrs. Crane and Wilson, and they're all there in my head, which is so cool.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. What was so fun about this book too was creating kind of complicated characters, because even the ones who are potentially good-hearted are also products of their time and self-motivated. It goes for all of them. Olive is certainly going to put her own needs first as often as she can. And Hazel, too, is not easy to break through and, sort of see what's altruistic about her. All those things are earned when they come. And I love that I was able to explore. This book it is longer than most of my books, and it feels sort of expansive in that way, that I was able to give a lot of kind of complicated emotional depth to some of these characters.
It's funny when you say it's short, because I don't know, because I always read all your books in one sitting. So I can't, they're really long. I can't really tell. And then yours, I thought, okay, is it over? Because your acknowledgements are a few pages too. So
I know. I feel like my acknowledgements are so ridiculous. I should stop, but I'm always like, okay, I would want to know where the idea came from and why you wrote this book and what you did to do the research. So they're pretty involved. You do not have to read them, but
and if you, like you said, rabbit holes, who knew that there's a mushroom named after her? So I found, and it's like, okay, that's really cool.
Good for you.
So that's basically, we're going over the characters and what happens to them moving from one place to another. And then, you have Tasmania, which was Van Diemen's Land for the longest time, and a U2 song.
Exactly.
So talk a little bit about Flinders, and you've talked a little bit about London at the time, but talk a little bit about Flinders and Van Diemen's Land, later Tasmania.
Yeah. So Van Diemen's Land is what the island was called, which is on the southeast coast of Australia. And originally, it was attached to the mainland. And when it separated from the mainland 10 million years ago, 6 million years ago, I have it in the acknowledgements, I think, the indigenous people who lived there were completely cut off. So they had their own culture. There were many different tribes, many different groups of them, but they were completely separated from everyone else until the Dutch arrived in 1603, and then eventually the British. But it's the size of Ireland, this island off the coast of Australia, and it has this very specific culture. half of all the women convicts who were sent to Australia were sent to Tasmania. It was called Van Diemen's Land. They changed the name to Tasmania in part because of the terrible convict stain that it had, because so many of the people there were descended from convicts. And the convict trade didn't end until the 1860s. So it went on for quite a long time. And even then there were some vestiges of it. And people would hide, when they had convicts in the family, they would hide those stories. Now they're pretty popular. People like to be associated with their convict past, which, by the way, is a similar story with the Orphan Train survivors, that many of them felt ashamed of what they'd been through, and they didn't want to admit it because they'd been made fun of and castigated and kept out from groups of people they were discriminated against. But their descendants were proud and are very proud of having Orphan Train riders in their past. So I found a similar thing in Australia. Tasmania is gorgeous, by the way. It is such a beautiful place, and I could live there. The central city, Hobart, is really cosmopolitan. Tons of great farm-to-table stuff going on, art happening, music. It's a very interesting place.
It's really funny because I haven't been there, but I've been to New Zealand, and yes, what's really interesting about, and it's beautiful too, both the North and South Islands. And the interesting thing is, no one thinks about America. So all the things that are on CNN and Fox and everything we hear of it has nothing to do with our lives. And it's so refreshing.
It is so refreshing. I'm afraid that Trump has infiltrated their news.
Don't start me up at all, because it'll go on for hours.
I know.
But the other thing is that, going back to the characters, it's like with Buck. I mean, you had to think I don't know how you do it. You had to think a long time about him. You knew him inside and out. At the very end, I thought, well, maybe there's a part of him, and that was really good. But I go towards these spoilers, but I stop just before I get there.
Buck was a stand-in or a representative of so many men in that time period who were convicts themselves, had been brutally mistreated. When they were freed, they had few options. They became sealers. Those were brutal men who went off and clubbed seals for a living and lived like savages. I have accounts from Aboriginal people saying these white savages who came in and are slaughtering all the seals. And then they also became guards for the convict women and for other convict men, and they were also sailors on the ships. So it was not a good situation to have those damaged, violent men guarding the women. Talk about a fox in a chicken coop.
Worse. I don't think you could actually get to how bad it was, because if you got to how bad it was, it might be unreadable, Yeah,
I couldn't do that. I mean, well, first of all, I chose a time period that was fairly civilized compared to what it had been like. In 1803, as I told you, when the British government made this decision to start the secret plan of exporting women to be breeders, essentially, it was a free-for-all. And the women would, first of all, they were completely at the mercy of the sailors. So that was terrible to begin with. There were no safeguards in the early 19th century. And then when they got to Australia, there would be a crowd. A notice would have been put in the paper. There'd be a crowd of 300 men at the bottom of the gangplank. And if a man, any man, chose a woman, a prisoner, her sentence was commuted and she belonged to him. That was how it worked. And then in the 1820s, the British press, as I said, got a hold of this story and were like, wait a minute, this sounds pretty terrible. And so they instituted some reforms and they built prisons called female factories for the women. And that was what I wrote about, was the 1840s when, believe it or not, there were many safeguards in place compared to how it had been. And so I didn't have to write about that brutal time. There's actually a movie called The Nightingale that is set in 1820s Tasmania. It's brilliant, and it's a much darker story than my novel.
Yeah.
And brilliant, like really great.
Would have taken away from it. I understand why you had to leave it out, and I didn't want it in there, but you knew that there was worse things that happened, because even if you talked about Newgate exactly the way it was, it just would be unreadable to a certain extent, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly my Goodreads reviewers, whom I appreciate, many of them are like, wow, conditions were not nice. This is really unpleasant. I don't think the whole book feels that way. And in fact, after I saw the movie The Nightingale, I called my editor and said, "Oh my God, do you think I need to be more graphic?" She said, "No, you do not need to be more graphic." And I was like, "You have plenty of stuff in there." But it's interesting to see the reaction to it. I think it's sort of a positive story, that things work out pretty well for some of them in the end. But I know it's a journey getting there.
That leads me to a perfect segue. It's like, after reading the book, I was taking a shower and I was thinking of my mom, who died June 21st. It was a really good death. And
I'm so sorry.
it's okay. She was surrounded by her 3 sons. It was like we were sitting at the kitchen table. Food was her highest priority in life. So she ate something 2 hours before she died. And she just took 3 breaths and was gone. Her last year was like the best year of her life. And she was, both my father and mother were larger than life. But my point is, before I do what I do, is I was thinking about her, and I was thinking, she's with me. She's still with me completely. She's just not with herself. And then I thought about Evangeline and the tree and the rings and her father. And then I thought about the shells and all that. And then I thought about your epigraph. And so explain, if you will, what the tree meant for Evangeline and what the shells meant for an Aborigine.
Yeah. Well, so Evangeline's father shows her with a cut log in the fireplace all the rings of the tree and says, think of the people in your life who are there now or have gone as these rings that support you, that you're the tree, but the rings that grow around your core are what keep you strong, make you strong. And I think my father had said that to me long ago, and it stuck with me, and I found that comforting. And in my story about Mathina, her mother makes necklaces out of these tiny mariner shells and these are traditional necklaces that the Aboriginal women made and still make. In fact, you could look them up. They're absolutely beautiful. And they're made out of these little green shells. And the mother says, you are the thread, and the people who matter are the shells, and you keep them close in that way. And it was sort of a different but similar idea. And I had read about that in Aboriginal culture as an idea, as a concept. So I was able to use both of those. It's always hard when you are playing with ideas like that, because you don't want to be too, I don't know, programmatic. You don't want to be too reductive, I guess. And so I wanted to play it carefully. I don't know if I pulled it off, but I liked the ideas and I wanted them to resonate throughout the book. So in some ways, I saw this novel as a passing of the baton from one character to the next, from Evangeline to Hazel to Ruby, and that they were sort of running this marathon and passing this baton. And those ideas of the tree and the necklace were passed from one character to the next throughout the book. And Mathina, her story was sort of woven through. Also, she's the one who had the necklace story. So yeah. It felt like it was another connection for them.
And I like, again, without getting too deep into it, I like the necklace exchange. Yeah, that was really good too, because it was, again, it described both characters involved in it perfectly. Like, one was just like saying, "Yeah, what the hell? They're yours," so I really like that. And then the other thing was, I've told all four of my children that story about the trees, and now I'm telling my grandchildren. And I've always loved looking at those rings because you can tell the good years and the bad years too.
That's right.
And
summer, winter, and summer.
Yeah.
All of those things.
There's a lot of rain or no rain. But yeah, it's a very excellent metaphor. And the other thing was, what I didn't want to miss was Ruby, I don't know, I'm going to say it, like going home. And when
I don't think it's too giving too much away to say that Ruby grows up and she is able to answer a lot of questions for herself that no one else was able to answer for her.
Yeah, and again, there's this symbol that transverses the entire book. And I question why someone thought it was as important as she did. But when I was saying,
mean the ring? Do you mean the ring or the
handkerchief?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, the ring was cool at the end what she did because I wasn't sure she was going to do that. But yeah, we all carry our, and that's what I was saying at the beginning about you identify with everybody because I hate to say it, but part of me identifies with Cecil because I know there's been times in my life where I should have stood up, should have done something that I didn't do, and here it is, this thing hanging over me.
Well, he isn't a bad person, and he's quite appealing, actually. He's clever, he's attentive, he's debonair. He's like no one Evangeline has ever met in her small village. She comes to London, and he showers her with attention. And also he appreciates her and recognizes her as a smart and interesting and vibrant woman, and she's never had that. Of course she would be drawn to him. And I think that in some ways, not to get too large about this, but in some ways he represented for me the British Empire, both its blindered qualities, the sort of largeness and the urbanity of it, but also ultimately the weaknesses that exist at the heart of it.
He was good, but he was weak. That's essentially what, especially like, and the other thing is how Agnes ends up. I thought that was really good because they belong together. I mean, yeah, whatever.
So perfect. Agnes is the housekeeper, and she's the catalyst for Evangeline's journey onto the ship. And so she shows up again in the book later, and you get to see what happened to her, which I loved that about this book. And so someone asked me in an earlier interview today about the term historical fiction, and because I wrote a whole thing for Poets and Writers about how I feel that it's often a female ghetto to call books historical fiction. Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys isn't called historical fiction. No. But I feel less that way about this book than I did about Piece of the World, which was actually quite a literary exploration and not overtly historically historical fiction. This book has some, what I see as some hallmarks of historical fiction. For example, the characters at the beginning who come in and then disappear show up again at the end. And so you have this sort of sense of a big story unfolding and of closure that I don't always provide in my other works.
I think the ghetto was started by, what's her name, Antonia Fraser. I think that's how it started with historical fiction.
That's interesting. You know what? The truth is, there are plenty of writers who identify as that they write solidly. They write historical fiction, and that is what they call it and want it to be. It feels to me that it can be a limiting genre.
Then, like Hilary Mantel, it's like I don't know what it is. I wouldn't call it anything in particular.
You know what I love? Hilary Mantel said that when she wrote these books, she was writing contemporary characters set in the past. Like that, yes, she paid attention to language and she paid attention to, the dialogue of the time, but she really was writing as if the story takes place today. And I think that's why those books are so popular. And I did that too. I very much, my dialogue and my language is a hybrid of the 1840s and today. I tried not to be anachronistic, but at the same time, I wanted it to feel familiar to people, the cadence of conversation and language. I wanted you to feel immersed and not as if you were reading. To me, sometimes historical fiction can feel as if there's a scrim between the reader and the writer, and there's this sort of elevated language that feels false to me. I'd rather read a book that pulls me in with the characterization and images and doesn't feel like someone's trying to write as if they themselves lived in that time period.
Do you want me to tell you how you did it perfectly?
Yes.
The way you did it perfectly was just one word, and it's only 2 letters.
What is that?
When you said ye. Ye is got you into that spot, and you didn't really have to try to create some kind of pirate slang for buck or anything like that. So it's just the ye, and Evangeline, and yeah, they just, when they use that.
And Hazel, and Hazel, it kind of outgrew it over time a little bit. But I that was the only word that I used, and I was even not sure about that. I even wondered if I should take that out. But I felt that I didn't even do it for a while. This is so technical and stupid, but for a while I had all the like you, your, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E, like I had it all, and then I just took it all out. I had all of those as contractions, and then I was like, forget it. I'm only going to use that one word and try to use it sparingly. And it's for Olive and Hazel mostly. But, and there was a real class difference of the people on the ship, and it was one of the most, it was fun to write from Athena's perspective and to write her dialogue because she was so educated compared to a lot of those white women that her language was perfect. She learned English flawlessly from a tutor. And so, so that was easy to do.
Yeah, it's, the only time ye would hurt would be if you were in college and you were assigned a 5-page essay, because it doesn't give you.
That's right.
I can't pronounce Mathena or Mathena. It doesn't come out right either way that I say it.
I say Mathena is what I think it is. Yeah. There's an audiobook that's excellent, and it just won the audiophile award, actually. It just won that because I picked this amazing woman named Caroline Lee, who's won all kinds of awards. She's a Shakespeare actress in Melbourne, and she did all the accents, and I'm getting so many raves about her audiobook of The Exiles. So I highly recommend it.
I'm definitely going to listen to it. And now, because of the IndieBound stuff for our website and all, you don't use Audible, but you can download all the Audible stuff.
It's not Audible. It's just a HarperCollins audiobook.
Libro? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
But, yeah, and Mathena, whatever.
And this book is an IndieBound for September.
Yeah, I know. Oh, yeah, I didn't even say all the different, on your website it shows all the different picks. It's not like...
We're not allowed to say that one yet, I guess.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, wait a minute. Which one?
About the IndieBound, because it's September.
Okay. No, I was going to talk about... Oh, yeah, I was going to talk about it's already being... And I said it to Brittany about it being optioned. And it was such a cinematic book. And, now with Netflix and Hulu and all those, it's like they love to have, season 1, episode 4, season 2, episode 3. And it's so cinematic, and you have all those chapters that it seems like it's perfect. Doesn't it?
Yeah, it's so exciting. I'm going to be really involved in it. I'm executive editor. Yeah. No, executive producer. I don't even know the terminology.
Yeah.
I'm very bossy, so I'm glad to be involved. I'm not going to be bossing them around, but I'm very opinionated, so I'm happy that they're going to listen to me.
Well, it will definitely teach you a lot, and
yeah,
it'll be a great learning experience. I'm really jealous, but I'm really happy for you. But it's going to be cool. Plus, I can tell everyone, yeah, I know her. Like I said, we spent a lot of time together.
spend a weekend together.
You said it. There was one other thing I was going to say, and then we can kind of conclude. Oh, well, first of all, yes, I would like, and I'll say it on the record, I know you're kind of booked, but if we can do another virtual or another event, this time virtual, I think it would be lovely to do that.
Yeah, let's definitely do it. That would be so much fun.
And I don't want to brag about it, but we really do have a good bantering kind of thing going that I like.
Definitely.
Okay. All right, well, this was great. We talked for exactly an hour and 33 seconds. And don't forget, I got to get the recording, and then I'll have my engineer get it ready, and we'll put it on. Oh, yeah, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to put it on right away? You want to wait till the publication date? What do you want me to do?
Brittany, what we should do, and I defer to her.
Okay.
That'd be great. Sam, as always, it's really fun. We could talk for another hour, and we'll do it again.
And the thing about reading a book closely, which I'm saying I did, is that
you really did.
The reason you do is because you like the book. I mean, it was like when I was in college and majoring in English literature. Of course I got A's. I read the book. And all my friends, Cliff Notes and Spark Notes, I was going, just read the book. And then they ask you questions about the book. And
well, that's why you are who you are. This is why you have a bookstore. This is why you are an impresario. And you really are immersive. And you feel as a writer, it's such a joy to feel the passion that you have for books.
And as a reader, I feel the same way. And yeah, okay. So this is great.
All right, thank you so much.
And we'll talk soon.